Well, thank you very much, and thanks for coming out on such a gorgeous Williamstown morning for a little discussion over coffee, tea, and terrorism. That's what I do, actually. Looking back, and this is my first time back in 25 years here at Williams, Williams really set me off on my journalism career. At an early stage, it was, of course, through professors like Kurt Tauber and Rick Nuccio in political science, and Antonio Jimenez in the Spanish department. I took my junior year in Madrid, and while I was there, it was actually Sonia Nazario who helped arrange a freelance job for me, working for Business Week and some major US publications, including Newsweek and the Chicago Tribune. And the biggest story that I worked on while I was in Spain as a young journalist started off very quietly. I was sitting in the Reuters bureau in Madrid, and we were listening to the roll call that the Spanish Parliament was taking of the new prime minister. And this is in 1981. Spain, of course, still a very fragile democracy after suffering through decades of dictatorship under Franco. And I had written up this story for several of these American publications, and all I had to do was fill in the vote count. And they got about a third of the way through the vote count, and all of a sudden there was a disturbance, and we could hear this. We're listening to it on the radio in this press room, and all of a sudden there were shots that were fired, and we heard in Spanish somebody shouting, "Al suelo, al suelo," to the floor, to the floor. And what this was, of course, was an attempt by some rogue officers of the Spanish military to stage a coup against this young democracy. Well, you can imagine, suddenly this newsroom erupts into activity. This is the biggest story out of Spain since Franco died, and he really was dead at that time. And it's just a flurry, and suddenly I'm getting calls from all over the US to these editors. I'm filling in for the normal correspondent, and they want to know, when can I file this huge story? So I'm typing away and filing, have to rewrite this whole story. And I remember as I was finished that evening walking back through the streets of Madrid, and it's quiet because there are actually tanks on the outskirts of the city, and people have their windows open and they're listening to television, they're listening to the radio, because the young king, Juan Carlos, has come on the TV to basically stand down these mutineers, order them back to their barracks. Very tense moment. It wasn't clear whether democracy was going to survive that evening. Fortunately, it did, and it really whetted my appetite for more foreign correspondent work. A couple years later, I've graduated from Williams, and unfortunately, it's 1982, probably one of the worst years for a young journalist to get started. It's a time when several major afternoon dailies in the United States have folded. There's a glut of experienced reporters out in the market, and I'm just trying to get an entry-level job anywhere I can get it. So one of the places where I'd applied, actually 3 times and had been rejected, but a 4th time I got a tip that there was an opening at a small paper in eastern Washington State called the Tri-City Herald. It's a McClatchy paper, circulation 28,000. And what was interesting about this job was it turned out the executive editor of that paper had a brother who was a religion professor at Williams by the name of Norman Peterson. Now, I had never taken Professor Peterson for any classes, but his brother was leafing through dozens of applications for that one job. He latched on to my name and saw Williams, and it jumped out and said, and I'm convinced to this day, and he's told me later, that had a factor in his decision to hire me for that entry-level job at a small paper. 10 years later, I've been fortunate enough to be hired by the New York Times, and I'm on my way to Saudi Arabia to cover the first Persian Gulf War in January of 1991. And who's one of my colleagues? John Kiffner, class of 1973. Those of you who maybe know Kiff, one of the most colorful, kind of legendary foreign correspondents the New York Times has ever had, a guy who covered the Iranian Revolution. He was based in Beirut and our bureau chief there. And he was a master at what we call parachuting into dangerous situations. Kiffner, oftentimes knowing only a few phrases of the local language, was able to hook up with a local fixer, somebody who could arrange for quick sources with him, and with a masterful eye for detail was able to bat out on just a few hours before deadline a wonderfully textured piece talking about whatever the latest coup or uprising or conflict there was in some foreign capital that he had just arrived in hours before. So there I am with Kiffner. I barely know the guy. He's a legend, and I'm just thrilled to be with him. And out of his pocket, he pulls his passport. And I swear to you, This thing, this dog-eared, battered thing, it was 2 inches thick, filled with visa stamps and other passports and extensions because, of course, by that time he had been traveling all over the world. And I looked at that and I said, there again is somebody I want to follow in the footsteps of, and traveling the world and covering hot spots for the New York Times, and I've been fortunate enough to do that. So Williams played a very important role in launching me in my career, and I'm happy to say that in the time since I left school here, Williams has made an even more formal connection to the promotion of journalism. Just 4 years ago, some friends and colleagues of Jeffrey Owen Jones, class of 1966, organized a fellowship to honor a graduating Williams senior who would be going off into journalism, and honored that fellowship with a $10,000 stipend to get that person started. It's a terrific idea, and I applaud all the efforts, the folks behind the Jones Fellowship in doing that and promoting the kind of journalism that we need more of in today's very busy and complex world. So I'm going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about what I do now for the New York Times, covering national security and specifically covering terrorism and the rise and the changing moods of al-Qaeda. And what I'm going to do is sketch out to you what I call the 5 phases of terrorism. The first phase is the declining terrorist threat, that is in Pakistan, where there's been some big news this week. The second phase is the terrorism that's on the rise, the so-called franchises of al-Qaeda that has sprouted up in places like Yemen and North Africa. The third phase has to do with the terrorists among us, homegrown terrorists, and the threat that American citizens pose to their compatriots. Fourthly is a threat that's actually an old threat that's coming back to the fore now, and that is the threat of state-sponsored terrorism, particularly with the tensions between Iran and Israel over Iran's nuclear program. And finally, I'll conclude with a discussion about where we are now, how the United States government has adapted to the threat over the last 10 years, and what we as citizens of the United States can do in talking about terrorism and thinking about that. So the first phase I'm talking about today is Pakistan, and really the decline, the rapid decline of the al-Qaeda hierarchy that fled from Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks, fled into Pakistan, and over the last 10 years have taken a beating. In particular, just since last May, of course, with the death of Osama bin Laden in the Navy SEAL raid, culminating this decimation, really, of al-Qaeda's senior ranks in Pakistan. Just this week, the latest number 2 leader of al-Qaeda in Pakistan was killed in a drone strike there. And it kind of reminds me that it used to be the number 3 job in al-Qaeda used to be the most dangerous job. Now it's number 2. It kind of shows you how their bench is thinned over time. So over 24 of these top leaders in Pakistan have been killed over the last 3 years or so, decimating their ranks and making it much harder for them to organize and plot the kind of attacks that they conducted on 9/11. In the treasure trove of documents that the SEALs recovered from bin Laden's safe house in Abbottabad, Pakistan, there were DVDs, flash drives, and other materials that gave us real new insights about bin Laden's thinking as he sat there frustrated and alone in relative comfort in this safe house, wondering why his minions, his lieutenants, could not conduct greater attacks against the United States, and worrying that the attacks they did carry out were killing innocent men, women, and civilian, fellow Muslims, and basically turning the Muslim street against al-Qaeda in many places. So much so to the point where he even thought of changing al-Qaeda's name. He was fearing that the brand was being tarnished by this. Now, that all said, this al-Qaeda remnants in Pakistan still pose a dramatic problem because they are still trying to acquire weapons of mass destruction, particularly radiological material that could be unleashed here in the United States. So they still pose a threat. One of the great irritants in all this, of course, is that just as they are really on the brink of being pushed into irrelevancy, right now the relationship between the United States and Pakistan is at its tensest time really in decades. And this comes after a year of a string of incidents that set this relationship into the deep freeze, starting with the raid itself that killed bin Laden, that both humiliated and embarrassed the Pakistani military that this could be conducted. And also, in November, a NATO airstrike that accidentally killed 24 Pakistani soldiers along the Afghan border. That prompted Pakistan to shut down vital supply lines that NATO uses to ship material from Pakistan into Afghanistan for soldiers there. It remains shut down to this day. So here we have a situation of real impasse and distrust between these two erstwhile allies at a key time, and where they're right on the brink of kind of really putting the final nail in the coffin of this main al-Qaeda leadership. So that leaves us to what is left for the American government to do about this. And that's why we continue to see drone strikes carried out in the tribal areas of Pakistan. The Pakistani government has said it is either unwilling or unable to go into this last safe haven called North Waziristan to root out some of these al-Qaeda fighters who continue to carry out attacks both in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. The downside, of course, of that is in carry out these strikes, it engenders huge anti-American sentiment. A feeling that whether it's real or perceived, these strikes are killing Pakistani civilians, and it's certainly in the mind of many Pakistani citizens is a violation of their sovereignty, despite the fact that this has the tacit approval of the Pakistani government, has had all along, despite their public protestations. I was in Pakistan last in December, my 5th trip in 3 years, and it was dramatically different from the trip I'd taken there just 18 months before. On that trip, I was actually able to embed with a Pakistani army unit who took me up with a Soviet-built helicopter, which is one of the scariest things I've ever been in. Landed in North Waziristan, they hop in an unarmored Humvee, and off we go on a road they said was checked for IEDs every day. These are roadside bombs. I have to believe them that they were true. I didn't want to think about it too much. And as we're up on a ridgeline overlooking where some of the Pakistani military units had been conducting operations, suddenly we heard shots being fired down the valley. So we jumped back into our vehicles and raced to this makeshift military hospital where they ushered me in, among my photographer, into this field operating room where there's this poor young Pakistani soldier squirming on the operating table. He'd been shot in the neck by a sniper at a checkpoint. Now, fortunately, he was going to live, it turned out. But it showed the kind of tension that existed there. But it also showed the kind of access I was able to get at that time. 18 months later, the tensions were so great not only between the US and Pakistan, but between the New York Times and the Pakistani security forces, that I was warned in so many words, you might not want to leave the capital on this trip, the most recent one in December. And we don't mean the threat from militants. The security services there, the suggestion was, might not hesitate to slip a little bit of information about the make and model of car that I had to some unsavory characters in the border areas. That's the kind of tension that we're facing in Pakistan today. Still, it's a relatively good news story, unlike the second phase of terrorism, and that is the affiliates. If you think of al-Qaeda as a corporation, they've been very busy developing franchises over the last 10 years in places like North Africa, East Africa, and Somalia. Even in Iraq right now, a resurgent al-Qaeda chapter there is worming its way into Syria and trying to exploit the political turmoil there for their long-term gain. But the real problem, the real franchise that's worrisome to American counterterrorism officials is the one in Yemen. This is the branch of al-Qaeda that orchestrated the so-called underwear plants bomber in December of 2009, young Nigerian man who tried to blow himself up over Detroit. 10 months later, same outfit, packs explosives into printer cartridges, puts them on cargo planes bound for Chicago, and but for a tip from Saudi intelligence, that plane could have likely blown up over the US at some point as well. And then, just a month ago, the word came that al-Qaeda had once again tried to smuggle a suicide bomber aboard an American plane. This time also with an underwear bomber. Underwear bomber 2.0, new and improved elastics, new and improved explosives. I mean, this thing was going to be very hard to detect, and I don't want to go into details of where it was going to be, because that was part of the magic here. But what was interesting about this, of course, one of the interesting parts about this was in how the media covered this story, because this has become a story in itself in recent days. The Associated Press got wind of this, the fact that this suicide bomber wasn't really a suicide bomber at all. He was a double agent working for Saudi, British, and American intelligence. He'd wormed his way in to the belly of the beast, entrusted the top leaders so that they gave him their crown jewel, this device that was going to blow up a commercial airliner. He smuggled it out, and that word somebody passed along to the AP. Now, the AP responded to a request from the White House, can you please hold off in publishing this information? The CIA wants to be able to extract the family members of the double agent because they will certainly be targeted by al-Qaeda once they realize they've been had by this guy, which was only going to be a matter of days once he left the country and they didn't see a plane go boom somewhere. So the AP did just that. They held up their part of the bargain. The bomber was already out. The operation was over, so that was not compromised. The issue was, can we get the family members out so we don't have any casualties there? This, of course, has set in motion a whole range of criticism, coupled on with the reporting of some of my colleagues on other stories about leaks of information here. And I think what this has shown is this tension between the government's responsibility to keep the public notified of threats, of genuine threats, which this was, to the traveling public, and obviously its obligation to maintain operational security of a very sensitive and highly classified operation. How do you balance that? When is the time that the American government should notify its citizens of a threat like that? This is the problem too, because as this threat has grown, the problem on the ground is the US has expanded the drone program. Now you have drones not only flying over the tribal areas of Pakistan, but increasing numbers over Yemen and Somalia, taking shots not only at Yemeni extremists, but even American citizens, people like Anwar al-Awlaki, who to be sure was no good guy. This was an American-born cleric. He preached in mosques in San Diego and Northern Virginia before turning over to become one of al-Qaeda's top propagandists and then one of its top operational planners in Yemen. He was put on a kill list by President Obama and targeted. Not given, according to the administration, given some additional review, but no public review and certainly no court review. A whole very tense debate going on within the administration over that as we speak. The problem here is, as these drone strikes have become more effective in taking out their leaders on the ground, it is again not only engendered the anti-American sentiment that it has in Pakistan, but my fear is that the drones are a tactic. And that's what they are. They're a weapon that have become a very effective tactic, but they become so effective that some people in Washington, I think, want to embrace them as a strategy unto themselves. When if you think about it, their use actually reflects a failure of strategy. Because if the strategy were working properly, and this is the publicly enunciated strategy of the the Obama administration, is that the US now wants to go in and train and equip indigenous security forces in Yemen, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Africa, so that these countries can take care of the threats so we don't have to. So the US doesn't have to send big armies into the Middle East again. That is something this country will not do again for many, many years. The lessons of Iraq and to some extent to Afghanistan as well. But this is the tension that we face. What do you do when the country where this threat is, where these extremists have carved out safe havens and are threatening the United States, what do? In this administration's answer is we go in with drone strikes to protect our national interest and protect our homeland security, and we'll live with the blowback, and we'll live with the future that entails. So that's the threat on the rise. The threat here at home, the homegrown threat, is harder to put your finger on. I put it in two categories. There are US citizens and US residents who living here have traveled overseas to be trained. I'm talking about people like Najibullah Zazi, was a young Afghan American, was a pushcart vendor in Manhattan, traveled and trained with al-Qaeda in Pakistan, came back and he moved to Denver where he set up shop in a small suburban condo, basically cooking up explosives. And what his plan was to carry out a series of backpack bombs on a 9/11 anniversary in 2009 in the New York City public subway system, carrying out as many as a dozen on the trains running from Lower Manhattan up to Penn Station. This would have been tragic. But luckily, he didn't follow his chemistry lessons very well, because as he's cooking things up in this condo outside of Denver, the mixture isn't right. He's not getting the consistency he needs. So he gets up on his cell phone and he calls back to his teacher back in the tribal areas and said, hey, it ain't working. What do I need to do? That conversation was picked up by British intelligence, who quickly funneled it to the CIA and the FBI, and just in time, because by this point, this guy is driving cross-country. Just a few days before the 9/11 anniversary, just a few days before the General Assembly is convening in New York with world leaders coming from all over the world to be in New York. It could have been a catastrophe. It was averted. The second instance involves a young man named Faisal Shahzad, a Pakistani-American man who seemed to have everything going for him. He was married with 2 young kids, lived in suburban Connecticut, had a great job as a financial analyst with Elizabeth Arden. But as he returned home to Pakistan on his periodic visits, he became increasingly radicalized by the drone strikes and by the tensions with the Israelis and Palestinians. He took up league with the Pakistani Taliban, who saw a great opportunity to get an American into New York City and carry out an attack. And that's exactly what Faisal Shahzad tried to do in 2010. Packed explosives into an SUV, put them in the middle of Times Square, and but for a sharp-eyed vendor who alerted a New York City police officer, that appeared to solve the issue and resolve what could have been a real catastrophe. What wasn't publicized at the time was that Faisal Shahzad also hadn't followed his chemistry lessons very well, because what he had tried to do was assemble a fertilizer bomb, not unlike what Timothy McVeigh did at Oklahoma City. The problem was he used the wrong kind of fertilizer. He needed a nitrogen-based fertilizer. He used something else. That thing never would have gone off. It was just going to fizzle. So it looked bad and it looked bad. But again, these are just near misses in this kind of pantheon of looking like that. The second category of threats has to do with that guy al-Awlaki I mentioned before. He, in making a whole slew of English language videos that remain online, despite the fact he was killed in a drone strike last fall in Yemen, were one of the prime motivators for individuals in their homes to be individually radicalized, just by watching this guy in perfectly idiomatic English, urging people on, saying, you don't have to be a part of a cell. You can pick up a weapon, we can teach you how to make a bomb, and you can do it yourself. And that poses a huge problem for law enforcement and the FBI, because it's very hard to detect 1 or 2 individuals who are motivated on their own and show no other signs, have no other connections that can be tripwires. So that's something we have to watch as well. The fourth threat has to do with this kind of back to the future threat. The idea that you could have state-sponsored terrorism, which is something that was obviously prevalent in the 70s and early 80s in the mix in the Middle East. But for the past decade has really been pushed off to the side a little bit, as we've had a decade of really Sunni-based terrorism, of stateless, transnational terrorism, of course, led by al-Qaeda. But with the recent tensions between Iran and Israel, what we have now seen develop over the last 18 months to 2 years is an overt, covert war being carried out between Iran and its proxies, including Hezbollah, and Israel and the United States. And what we've seen, for instance, at least 4 Iranian scientists have died in mysterious circumstances. The Iranians don't think it's mysterious at all, and they've retaliated by going after and trying to attack Israeli diplomats in places like Bangkok and the Republic of Georgia. And then in the most audacious plot of all, trying to come up with a plot to kill the United States ambassador to Saudi Arabia in Washington at his favorite restaurant. And who did they go to? The Quds Force, which is an arm of the supreme leader of Iran's security forces. They turned to a used car salesman in Texas who said he had connections to the Zetas, the drug gang in Mexico, and they were going to hire a hitman. And this guy went and he did. He hired a hitman from the Zetas. Now, fortunately for the Saudi ambassador and for everybody in this story, this guy turned out to be a DEA informant. Again, once again, if he had maybe gone to a guy who really was a hitman, who wasn't connected to the government, who knows what could have happened? So this is the kind of thing that's going on today, and it's the reason why there's so much tension, because the fear, of course, is that the Israelis will carry out a strike against the Iranian nuclear facilities, and once they do that, what will be the Iranian response? What will be the retaliation? We don't know exactly whether it will be more attacks against the United States homeland, whether it will be attacks against American troops in Afghanistan or other interests of ours and other Western allies in Europe itself. That's why the US and Israel have come up with alternative solutions. The Stuxnet worm that you all may have been reading about. Particularly this week, my New York Times colleague David Sanger has a new book out where he talks in great detail about a story that's been out there that is a cyber weapon called Stuxnet. It's a worm that's been able to basically infiltrate into the Iranian centrifuges. These are the centrifuges that enrich the uranium to make it into bomb quality. And the absolutely magnificent part of this virus is not only how it can go into the centrifuges and basically force them to spin out of control. That's pretty cool in itself, if you think about it. But the even cooler thing about it is how a second operation of this virus basically can replicate what it looks like if nothing is happening to the nuclear facility as it's going on and flash that up on the screens to the security monitors who are watching. It's kind of like you have a bank heist and the guards are watching the tape, but the bank robbers have pre-recorded something. It's just a blank hallway while they're running around in real life and they're running this tape, and the Iranians are doing the same thing. They're basically wondering, why are our centrifuges blowing up left and right? We're looking at the screen and nothing's happening. Nobody's there. Ingenious. And there are other things like that, no doubt highly classified, that are working toward this. The threat, of course, is what happens next? What happens if there's a provocation that sets off a shooting war and the implications for that? Finally, I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about how this response has been taken by the US government and its allies. And as my colleague Tom Shanker and I were starting to report our book, Counterstrike, a couple of years ago, we went around the US government and people told us, to really understand what the threat is today, and this was early 2008, you have to understand what the threat was on 9/11 itself. And so as we went and talked to people in the White House and the State Department, they said, you would not believe how little the United States government knew about a couple of things. The first thing, and this became one arc of the book, was how little the United States government really knew about Al-Qaeda and about terrorist organizations in general. And as we talked to people who were actually in the White House, and it became clear to those people who was responsible for the attacks on 9/11. There were actual people wandering around the hallways that afternoon going, Al who did this? Carried out this strike? That was the level of understanding, or lack of understanding, in the White House at the time about this. The Bush administration, as it came in, was not focused on terrorism, as the administrations had not really been up to that point. It was focused on China, a rising China. It was focused on missile defense. And so it really missed the threat that was coming up, and even the threat warnings that were coming up that summer. So our book tries to kind of watch this evolution of how you understand this threat, going from where we were in 9/11 to where we are today, understanding a much better feel for the fact that Al-Qaeda is a network, and you can attack it as a network. The second arc of the book has to do with the response to 9/11. Understandably sending small military forces into Afghanistan initially to help oust not only the Al-Qaeda fighters who were there and Osama bin Laden, but toppled the Taliban government. That happened, but it happened using a strategy where the US felt if they could only kill or capture enough of these Al-Qaeda fighters and their commanders, that this whole movement would fall, would collapse. There was no real understanding of what was behind it, and it was much more of a movement. And it wasn't until October of 2003 that then Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld pens a very important memo, an internal confidential memo, to about half a dozen of his top civilian and military aides. Now, at this point, we always had to remind our editors of the New York Times that just because Don Rumsfeld wrote this memo didn't make it automatically wrong. Every once in a while, that blind squirrel, No, really. Secretary Rumsfeld actually in this memo came up with a very important question to his advisors. He's saying to them in October of 2003, and remember, this is now 2 years after 9/11, the insurgency in Iraq now is really taking off. He asked his advisors, are our operations today actually creating more militants than we're taking off the battlefield? Because if they are, we need to change our strategy to be more effective against this very resilient and adaptive enemy that Al-Qaeda is. And so Rumsfeld has now put out the word. So what is the response within the government? Well, interestingly enough, not only is it to sharpen their operations on the ground with the traditional bombs and bullets, but there was some interesting thinking going on inside the Pentagon that is extended to today's world. And it involved a very bright PhD student from Berkeley, a Hollywood handsome guy named Matt Kroenig, who was on detail for a special summer fellowship at the CIA for the summer. He also had a couple of weeks where he was detailed over to the Pentagon, where he was hooked up with a senior analyst in the Pentagon, a veteran Cold Warrior by the name of Barry Pavel. And these two guys together came up with an idea where they too posed an interesting question, and it is this: are there elements of classic Cold War deterrence, that approach that kept a tense peace between the US and the Soviet Union for so many decades, are there elements of that approach that we can update and modify to adapt against terrorism, adapt against Al-Qaeda, to deter them from attacking us? Well, Kroenig and Pavel took this idea around the Pentagon and the White House and other places, and the initial response was met with stern skepticism. People were looking at this and say, well, this can't work. I mean, deterrence, at least in the Soviet model, is based on the fact that we can target places like the Kremlin and Soviet military bases, and even the dachas that the Politburo members keep for their Bolshoi ballerina mistresses. Things with addresses that we can strike with our ICBMs, and of course, the Soviets had their whole list here in the United States. So how does this work when you're dealing with an organization, a transnational organization that doesn't have a headquarters? They don't really they don't value anything physical that you can hold at risk. Well, this was the other insight that they had, was that terrorists, while they may not value specific things, they have virtual values. They value their honor, their prestige, their position within the community, the Ummah, their whole capability of being successful. And so if you can undermine that in certain ways, you perhaps can deter, disrupt, or at least delay the kind of attacks that they've been plotting. Well, this sounds great, and it was quickly adopted at the highest levels of the Pentagon, despite some concerns from George Bush that this sounded a little bit too namby-pamby, this deterrence stuff. You know, he was a war on terror president. I don't know about this deterrence stuff. But he was convinced by some of his top military commanders and by Rumsfeld that this was worth at least a try. Well, it's one thing to have come up with a good idea in Washington and run it through the policy circles and all. It's another thing when you're a commander on the ground in Helmand province in Afghanistan or Western Iraq and you're dealing with full-fledged insurgencies going all out. In our book, we talk about several examples of how it turned out that there were ways of translating this idea into real practice on the ground. And I'm just going to mention my favorite to this one. And it had to do with a militant cell that's operating in Iraq. This is a militant cell that's carrying out routine small arms attacks, roadside bombs, and other assaults on US and Iraqi troops. And the Americans are finally saying, this is just getting out of hand. We got to get after this cell, and we got to get after its very smart and clever leader, a guy named Ahmed. So they did what a lot of Western organizations would think. They basically put out a reward for him, basically thinking the locals would turn him in if the reward was high enough. The problem is it didn't work. It didn't work because half the people were scared to death of this guy, and if it was ever found out that they ratted him out, he'd come back and kill them and their entire extended family. No qualms. The other half, however, secretly sympathized with him and didn't want to help the Americans in any way. The attacks keep continuing, they're getting more violent, the bounty's going up, it's not working. The Americans are just beside themselves because they can't figure out how to get this guy because he's gone silent. You know, he's communicating through messengers, they don't know where he is, nobody's telling him out, ratting him out or anything. But then one of the guys on the team remembers that he's been hearing some of this talk about deterrence and how you identify nodes and networks. And he says, you know what, I think we can work with this idea if we think about what are the virtual values that Ahmed has that we can exploit. And so what the Americans did with their Iraqi allies is instead of raising the bounty, they lowered the bounty. And then they got some surrogates and they went out in the Iraqi marketplaces and they started spreading the word that Ahmed wasn't nearly the terrorist that he was before. After all, when was the last time you saw the guy? He's gone into hiding, he's scared. Not only that, the word went, but his fighters are deserting. They're going off because he can't pay the payroll. All sorts of bad things are happening to Ahmed's gang and crew. Well, this goes on for a few days, and you can imagine who hears about it in his little hidey hole, Ahmed, and he is pissed off. How dare these Americans spread this vicious propaganda against me, one of the greatest terrorists in southern Iraq? This is terrible. The casualties are mounting. How can they say I'm not effective? So he gets up on his cell phone and starts calling around to his lieutenants to make sure they really haven't defected. And that's exactly what the Americans wanted in the first place, because that plays right into another theme of the book and how over the past decade there's been a tremendous advance, technological advances in the art of warfare, but in particular in the art of surveillance and reconnaissance. The ability of the Americans working with their allies to suck up just about every electronic communication in this battle space. Text messages, emails, cell phones, crunch them through supercomputers, voice recognition systems, and then locate these kind of things in increasingly small time. And that's exactly what happened with Ahmed here. They went in and they rolled him up, and they rolled up the half a dozen other guys he'd made the mistake to call and took down this cell that had been such a problem for so long. This kind of shows the evolution of thinking about how you get to an enemy without just bombs and bullets, understanding how they work and how they network. It also shows the advances that have been made in hacking into cyberspace, which is one of the great safe havens that terrorists have today, where they do a lot of their recruiting, their financing. Americans have been able to hack into the cell phones of terrorist leaders, spread false and confusing messages to their fighters. They've been able to send Arabic speakers into chat rooms and basically raise nothing more but provocative questions, such as, why is it, dear brothers, that we are supporting an organization that kills dozens of innocent men, women, and children in a bomb at a wedding party in Amman, Jordan? How does this organization represent the best of our great religion? In basically instilling doubt and confusion among the fence sitters and young men who are in this organization. So where does that leave us today? Kind of looking back over these phases that I've talked about this morning. I think where it leaves us is, as I've mentioned before, that original al-Qaeda threat, that hierarchy is almost gone. There's really only one guy left from the old gang, Ayman al-Zawahiri. He's the number one now, took over from bin Laden. The bigger threat comes from these franchises, increasingly regional, but also with aims on the United States, the threat here in the home, the potential for threat of this new state-sponsored terrorism. And it's for this reason that Tom and I conclude in our book that the United States will be hit again by another terrorist attack. We can't say when, we don't know exactly how. That's been the whole process here over the last 10 years, is to try and push that day down the road and to diminish the effectiveness of that attack when it comes. But the problem is the United States and its allies have to be good and lucky all the time to prevent another attack, just as we saw with those couple of instances of the chemistry lessons that went awry. The terrorists only have to be lucky every once in a while for that attack to come. And so that's why we say it will come. And it's not only an attack that necessarily will be a big spectacular one, although that still seems to be al-Qaeda's MO. They love to go after aircraft because it's not only a big splash, but also because of this important reason. It has economic consequences, and they understand that. In fact, after that al-Qaeda branch in Yemen thwarted, the plot was thwarted on the printer cartridge, they came out and bragged that plot only cost them $4,200. And yet the response was the US had to shut down global transport, air transport, for a couple of days, and then spend hundreds of millions of dollars to secure and defend that system against another attack for $4,200, not a bad investment. That's the way al-Qaeda is looking at things now. That's the way these affiliates are looking at it. They don't necessarily need a big 9/11 style attack anymore. So the other main conclusion that we come to in our book is this. If there is going to be another attack, and we think there is, the government, starting with the president all the way down, has not taken enough time to instill a sense of resiliency into the American public. And by this, we don't mean physical resiliency. I think anybody who watched the ceremony of the 10th anniversary of 9/11 can take great pride in how the United States and Americans have built up what al-Qaeda tore down in lower Manhattan on that day. What we're talking about is psychological resilience, the kind of resilience the Israelis have, the Brits have, and other Europeans who've gone through these domestic terrorism violence. And their approach is this. When these attacks happen, we mourn our dead, we clean up the debris, and then we move on. It's a criminal act. We're not going to overreact. We're not going to play into the hands of the terrorists and give them what they want. And unfortunately, I think that's to some extent what happened after 9/11. This country overreacted because it didn't understand the threat. It didn't understand al-Qaeda well enough to know what it was and what it wasn't. Too often, there was the insinuation, or suggestion at least, that al-Qaeda at that time posed the same existential type threat to the United States as the Soviet Union did to the Cold War. It wasn't true then, it's not true now. But we know that now because we've gone through a decade of understanding what their capabilities are and how they can be thwarted. But we also have to be realistic to understand that they can strike again on whatever scale, and we have to be ready for that. So here's the problem. The United States hasn't had that ability to inure itself against these kind of attacks like our European partners have. So what do? If you're President Obama, you can't go out there and say, hey, suck it up, we're going to get hit, be tough, you know? You can't do that. You can't do that, and certainly not in a presidential election year where you could be accused of being weak on defense or national security. What we talk about is starting a national conversation. And Obama, to his credit, did this on the 9/11 anniversary, talking about the so-called R word, resiliency. Because when you unpack that word, there's the implication that we will be struck again. But at least the American public is aware of what the risks are. And when it happens, we don't overreact. We don't finger point and play the blame game, partisan or otherwise. We pull together and we move forward, and we don't let the enemy, whatever it is, the al-Qaeda force or whatever extremist force, take advantage of that uncertainty. I'm going to stop there and throw it open to questions, but I really appreciate your coming out this morning. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Well, it's interesting because this question really depends on where you sit. I'm sorry, the question is, can you assess kind of where we are with the Iranian nuclear threat today? And of course, it's very hard to understand exactly where we are because it really depends on whether you take at face value what the supreme leader has said of Iran, that they do not and have not yet developed the actual bomb, and they even haven't decided yet whether to build a bomb. There's a fundamental disagreement within the allied community of whether they believe that statement. U.S. intelligence basically says, okay, we take him at his word because we can watch certain things in the technical areas, we can't tell you about them, but trust us, that if they cross some red lines, we know they will have made a decision to go forward. The Israelis don't buy that. Some of the allies don't buy that. They feel, how can you possibly trust this regime? And if you believe that, and if you give them time through these negotiations that we're now embarked on, the world leaders are embarked on, it only buys them time to move farther down the road on this program. So interestingly enough, on Netanyahu's last visit to Washington, he came away with two very important concessions, or at least commitments, from President Obama. One was that the United States would promise to take out any kind of nuclear military program that Iran would have. There's a distinction of when that might take place, though. Obviously, nobody, certainly in this administration, wants it to happen this year, certainly in this kind of political cycle. But the other reason, not just for political reasons now, because we just, again, as I mentioned before, we just don't know what the second and third order effects of an attack like that are going to be. What will Iran do? We don't know. So that's kind of where. The other second point that he came away with was a commitment from President Obama not to embrace a containment strategy. Basically saying, if the Iranians get a bomb, so be it. We think we can contain them like we have with other regimes, like we're basically having to do with North Korea now, much less others, and we can live with that. The problem with that approach is, besides the Israelis not believing it, is it would almost certainly set in motion a number of other Arab countries in the Middle East, Saudi, perhaps Egypt, who would want to have their own nuclear program if their arch rival, the Iranians, did. So it's something that the situation was quite tense in the spring. It seemed to calm down a little bit now. Now it seems to be spiking up just a little bit. It's always hard to tell because there are rhetorical positions that each side is staking out, and without knowing exactly what's going on the ground, it's hard to tell. But then you read about, in more detail, about things like Stuxnet, and I think that's really what's going on behind the scenes. Nobody I think on either side wants to have a shooting war over this. And so what you're seeing are these very highly classified cyber operations going on to try and take down this capability, or at least delay it and defer it. Again, there's that theme, delay it and defer it to another day when perhaps this government in Iran will collapse. I'll start with the second question first about the concern about drones and the real proliferation of drones. Obviously, we've seen the focus has been on the armed drone program that not only the US has, but the Israelis have, the Brits have. It was just, I reported a story in the New York Times that the Italians now want armed drones. Go figure. The problem here with drones is that it's not a huge leap from the surveillance drones that all sorts of countries have, that we have here in the United States, that are increasingly being used by civilian law enforcement for surveillance, not only along the US-Mexico border, but inside the United States. When is it going to be when the Russians basically decide they want to arm drones and go after what they consider terrorists in one of their restive, parts of their country, or the Chinese or another country? I think this is the problem that I think we're facing, is this drone technology takes on greater currency. And as I was saying, talking a little bit more about limiting it to a tactic you use only as a last resort, which is what it originally started out as, and now this fear that it could be embraced as a strategy unto itself. And people around the world are looking at the Americans and saying, wow, that looks pretty good. Maybe we'll go after criminals in our own country using that. Who's going to stop them from doing that? It's a real valid question. In injecting doubt, this is the whole strategy, whether it's in terms of the number of virgins you're going to get or whatever the benefits are. That is exactly another story that we talk about in this book, is how there was a whole cell of suicide bombers coming in from Syria into Iraq. And one of the ways the Americans combated this was they initially just tried to kill these guys individually as they came in. It was like ants, they kept appearing out of nowhere. And so what they did was they found out, because it took more time to understand how these networks worked. And it turned out these suicide bombers only went forward with their attacks once they were blessed with a Sharia emir, a religious holy man who would bestow upon them, basically say, guarantee in their minds that they would get these virgins and that their families would be paid, death payments after they were gone. So what the Americans did, working with the Iraqis, was they started going after these emirs, capturing and killing some of these guys who were not nice people and were not missed in their communities. And suddenly, without the blessing of the holy men, these young jihadis refused to go forward because they didn't think they were going to get the benefits. It's like, what am I going to do this for if there isn't something in it for me? And the Al-Qaeda had to run around and find junior emirs who weren't qualified and frauds and, emir by mail program. It just, it just didn't work. And so people get it. And, it took a while, though, to get beyond this idea that you use blunt force at every turn, because oftentimes it didn't work and it was counterproductive. You were killing civilians that just created more militants for you. If you can think like a terrorist and think and get inside their head, which is what we're doing more and more of, and use the technology creatively, I think that's the way you're seeing more operations today. In the back. I would refer you to a very good website called globalsecurity.org. They are a great website in terms of assessing not only the location of US military bases overseas, but a lot of other good analysis. So I'd recommend you to that. There are no more American bases in Iraq. There are no more American troops in Iraq. As of December, the last US troops were withdrawn. There was some talk initially of leaving behind a small force to help train and help equip Iraqi forces, and also perhaps leave behind some special operations forces that could conduct the kind of black ops that we've seen in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. Those talks did not work out, and so all US forces are out. The US Embassy, which at the time, I think it may still be the largest US Embassy in the world, has been shrinking, as is the CIA station in Iraq. The American presence in Iraq is shrinking, at least the formal government presence. There are now more contractors going in to take the place of the Americans in helping State Department. But to your specific question, I'd refer you to that website. So what we talk about in this book is how the approach has gone from what we call kind of kill and capture, that initial impulse that you kill and capture your way to victory, and quickly was revealed to be ineffective, to a much more holistic approach to fighting terrorism. where you now have government agencies that are playing a much more important role in terrorism than never did before. The State Department, to your specific question now, its diplomats now on the ground in embassies around the world and consulates are working much more closely with local non-governmental organizations to try and identify and ameliorate the root causes of terrorism. It's oftentimes some kind of poverty, lack of education, lack of hope in many ways, lack of a feeling of injustice that's being perpetrated on them. So you have State Department diplomats doing a very effective work around the country and around the world doing that.
Excuse me, that's still not the theology when they say Allah is great. They're not talking about being poor. They're talking about Allah is great.
Okay, so here's the other question. The other problem is the Americans initially tried to get involved in what you can call the war of ideas, or propaganda wars. And initially the whole idea behind, at least in the Bush administration, was you get people like Karen Hughes and Margaret Tutwiler, and if you just talk loudly enough at them about how great democracy is, they'll get it. Well, that didn't work. It didn't work at all because it turned out Americans don't have any credibility on the Arab street in that. So what quickly became the real, I think, attempt to work this out is to identify credible Muslim voices who could attack the theology on toe-to-toe. If you could get imams and other senior religious leaders to come out against the al-Qaeda imams and basically say, you're full of shit, and they had some credibility behind their talk, then now you've got movement. The problem is any imam who came up and said things like that almost immediately was targeted. They were killed and there was intimidation campaigns, and so it's very difficult to get that kind of movement going. So what has been happening, however, is you've seen more and more of these al-Qaeda strikes that kill civilians. Over time, there has been a general feeling of enough is enough. And people are buying into more of the fact that this is a bankrupt ideology, a bankrupt theology, but it's taking time. And it's taking time for the counter side in the Muslim world, not the American world. Because again, anything the Americans touch on this would be seen as tainted. But how can the American government, behind the scenes, help amplify those voices? It's a really tricky proposition in places like Pakistan and Yemen and others where the anti-Americanism is already so high, and anything that happens, the suspicion is it's either the CIA or the Mossad, and it was behind it. So it's a real challenge, U.S. government. Yes, sir. No, it doesn't. And I'm not an expert, obviously, in Israeli politics or the U.S.-Israeli relations. I have colleagues at the Times who have done much more reporting on that. But I think you have two very very prominent leaders here. You have President Obama, President Netanyahu, obviously are political animals. They're both in kind of ongoing political campaigns, and they are both, Netanyahu certainly, I think, understands the situation now and is trying to perhaps take advantage or exploit the situation. We have a political situation of a presidential election year where he's forcing the president to be as tough on the Iranians as he possibly can. The Americans, at the same extent, don't want to go rushing off into some half-cocked war. We've seen that movie before, and it's been ugly. And I think, though, that's why you have to kind of weigh this rhetoric very carefully, understand where it's coming from, both on the American side, the Israeli side, and everywhere else, and look behind the scenes. What are they not talking about? This Stuxnet program, I think, is the heart of it. That's what I think they're really focused on. The rest of this, it ratchets up the tensions, it up oil prices, makes people very nervous, but the real action is going on with the spies, the cyber spies and the real spies behind the scenes. I think we have time for a couple more. Maybe one in the back. Yeah, the cooperation, particularly since 9/11, has gotten much better. Just as I talked about this more holistic approach, where you have the government agencies like the State Department, the FBI, the Treasury Department now working much more closely, sharing information. The same is true with allies working together, because if you think about it, al-Qaeda is a transnational threat. You can't just stop fighting them at your nation's borders. We have to all be working together, sharing information. So you have some kind of odd bedfellows at times. Some of this was revealed in the WikiLeaks documents quite explicitly in the cooperation President Saleh of Yemen was giving on one hand with drone strikes there, while publicly having to say other things for domestic political consumption to his public. But in all, the cooperation is much better, particularly as you go farther out into the field. Yes, sir. Yeah, so this is a fundamental problem that's been in the news this week as the House and Senate Intelligence Committees in Washington have called for hearings and pressed the government for a Justice Department investigation into the leaks of these information. Just to give you a quick kind of primer on how we operate in the national security world, I think there's a perception that when these stories come out, it's as a result of some official in the government, maybe even the White House, kind of knock, knock, knock on your door and handing you that blank manila envelope with all the secret war plans in them, the equivalent thereof. Aside from the WikiLeaks documents, which really were that, we just had to sort through it, that almost never happens. What we have to do in this business is take a little nugget here that somebody has given us, some trusted source that we've developed over many years. You're sitting down with coffee and he says, you know what, the weirdest thing happened to me yesterday. We had this meeting over at the White House and, click, okay, one data point. Then you take it over here to the State Department source you have, who sees things, who covers the same material but from a different light. And you run this by him, he says, well, that's kind of right, but let me give you my take on it. And then you take it to the CIA and the Defense Department, and you go up to Congress, and you go to some expert, or you go to some academic who's just come back from the country that you're writing about. It's a mosaic. It's a series of puzzle pieces that you're putting together that almost no one person has the complete picture on. And when you're finally done with it, and it involves classified information, which we deal with all the time in our business, we then go to that agency, be it the CIA or the Defense Department or oftentimes the White House, and say, here is what we plan to run in the New York Times tomorrow or post on our website tonight. Do you have a problem with this, either for factual accuracy or in context, or more importantly, for any concerns you have about whether this jeopardizes national security, operations and sources and methods, or anything else that could get people hurt? And we work with the administration on that. We don't necessarily give in to them, but oftentimes we can shade details like what you're talking about so it doesn't give away the store to the enemy. We can alert and make aware to the public, here are some successes or some failures in American policy or weapon systems or operations, but without going into so many details that it tips off the bad guys. Now the question is, did the reporting that we had on Stuxnet, for instance, or even the drone campaign, did that cross that line? And that's a debate that we're having now. Not only is the press having it, the media is having it with the administration, but will soon now be the subject of congressional hearings. Right now, that's kind of the debate, and it's a debate we go through every day, but just to make sure that we are obligated, as journalists at the New York Times at least, and I think I can speak for most of my colleagues at other main news organizations, that when you get a sensitive piece of information, you go to that agency and you get their comment, but you also say, is publishing this going to do damage in some way? You have to make a legitimate argument to me. You can't say, oh, it's going to be embarrassing to us. Because the WikiLeaks documents were very embarrassing to a lot of people in the US government, particularly the State Department. But there were names that we took out of those documents, for instance, to protect the identity of individuals on the ground who could be targeted by their governments or by terrorist networks. But we go about this in what I think is going to be a responsible way. Anyway, thank you very much. I'm going to be sticking around a little bit more out in the lobby selling books, talking to people with other questions. But thank you very much. It's been a great audience.